You might have heard the joke that by marrying Arwen, Aragorn was actually marrying his cousin. It's actually straight up true, Arwen and Aragorn are related, but that relation is 62 times removed at the smallest. But funnily enough, Aragorn isn't just related to Arwen, he's also distantly related to many other characters that appear in The Lord of the Rings. So in this video, let's explore how Aragorn is kind of everyone's cousin. Okay, sure, if you go back far enough, everyone is related, but chances are you probably don't know much about your heritage more than 4 or 5 generations back. But this is not true for Aragorn. In fact, Aragorn's lineage can be traced back over 10,000 years, through both Arnor and Gondor, through Númenor, through Beleriand in the First Age, and even to the waters of Cuiviénen where the Elves first awoke. Fortunately, we don't need to go back that far, but just by tracing Aragorn's lineage through the Third Age, we can see how he isn't just Arwen's cousin, he's also the cousin of characters like Denethor and his sons, Boromir and Faramir, and interestingly enough, he's also the cousin of the Kings of Rohan, Theoden and his successor, Éomer. Alright, let's start with what seems like the most obvious relation, that relation between Aragorn and Denethor and his 2 sons. After all, they're all Dunedain, so it isn't unreasonable to assume that they're related somewhere down the line. And that's exactly the truth. But how exactly? Well, all of these men are descended from Anarion, Isildur's younger brother. While Aragorn is often called Isildur's heir, it's important to note that he was also descended from Anarion, through King Ondah's daughter, Firiel, who married Arvedui, the last king of Arthedain. As for Denethor and his sons, it goes back to a man named Hurin of Emin Arnon. Hurin was the steward of Gondor, first under King Menadil back in the 17th century. Hurin was clearly an exceptional individual. Before him, stewards had been selected from Gondor's nobility on the basis of merit, but never came from the royal house. But after Hurin, the position of steward became hereditary, passing through his line, the line that would be called the House of Hurin, and that's the line that Denethor and his 2 sons belonged to. So while Hurin was not of the royal line, it still said that he was a kinsman of King Menadil, which means that he was probably a cousin of the king, at least a few times removed, far enough to be considered removed from the royal line. So in that way, Hurin was also a descendant of Anarion. However, we don't know which king he was actually descended from. Given this occurred shortly after the kin strife, it probably wasn't too far back, meaning that he may have been descended from King Aldemir or possibly King Jarmendikill II. Given we don't know exactly which king Hurin was descended from, nor do we know the exact amount of descendants that occurred between himself and Pelennor, who was a steward of his line 200 years later, it's impossible to know just how distant the relation between Aragorn and Denethor is. However, from Aragorn's lineage, we know that King Aldemir was 25 generations back, so Aragorn might be Denethor's cousin 25 times removed. If we want to measure this by time, then we know that their last common ancestor was probably at least 1500 years back. So yeah, while the relation isn't close, it's still quite interesting to point out that Denethor and his sons were also from the same legendary lineage that produced Aragorn, minus the Kings of Arnor and the last few Kings of Gondor. But given Hurin established what was essentially a cadet branch of the House of Anarion, technically removing his descendants from the royal line, we can see how the stewards of Gondor couldn't just press their own claims on the throne and declare themselves the king after the line of kings ended, despite also being descended from Anarion. But perhaps an even weirder relation is that of Aragorn and the Kings of Rohan. Yes, Aragorn was a cousin of Theoden and his successor Éomer as well. Okay, but how? Because it's not like Rohan ever had any interactions with Arnor. After all, Arnor ended 500 years before Rohan was founded. But once again, this relation comes through Aragorn's oft-forgotten Gondorian heritage, and funnily enough, in this case, Aragorn and Theoden's common ancestor is a Northman, the self-proclaimed King of Rhovanion, Vidugavia. Vidugavia was a Northman prince who existed in the 13th century of the Third Age. He had the favour of King Jarmendikill II and was thus put in power after he allied with Gondor against the Easterlings. In order to further strengthen relations with the Northmen, Jarmendikill sent his son, Valakar, to live among them. This plan worked a little too well. Valakar ended up marrying a Northman princess, Vidumavi, the daughter of King Vidugavia, and together they would have a son, Vinitharya, or commonly known as Eldacar. Eldacar's mixed heritage was a reason for the Kinstrife civil war that later devastated Gondor. As I talked about before, Aragorn is a descendant of Anarion, so therefore he was also a descendant of Eldacar, and therefore he was a descendant of Eldacar's grandfather, King Widugavia. So how is Theoden related to Widugavia? While we don't know their names or how many they numbered, we know for certain that Widugavia did have other children. We know this because around 600 years later, a Northman named Mahari fought alongside the Gondorians against the Wainriders during the Battle of the Plains, and Mahari is specifically stated to be a descendant of Widugavia. With the loss of Rovanion, it was Mahari's son, Marwini, that led his people to the Vales of Anduin, where they would become known as the Aethiod. The line of Widugavia would continue there through Forthwini, Frumgar, Fram, and through an unnamed amount of lords of the Aethiod until it reached Leod. Leod was the father of the legendary Eorl the Young, who rode to Gondor's aid during the Battle of the Fields of Celebrant. Eorl was the first king of Rohan, and both Theoden and Eomer were descended from him. So, through the Kings of Rohan, the Lords of the Aethiod, and the Kings and Princes of Rovanion, Theoden also had a common ancestor with Aragorn in Widugavia. So Aragorn's relation with Theoden is much more distant, not on the account of time, over 1700 years, but rather on the account that the Northmen had shorter lifespans, so on Theoden's side, there were many more generations that lived and died. On Aragorn's side, he's 27 times removed from Widugavia. So once again, like Aragorn's relation with Denethor, it isn't close, but it's interesting to see that history happened in a way that meant that Aragorn ended up related to a king of a people that were entirely unrelated to his own. Another funny little note is that if Hurin of Emin Arnin was descended from Eldacar or later, that would mean Denethor is also related to Theoden. But it's important to note that while Theoden was related to Aragorn and possibly Denethor, he does not share the same legendary lineage. They are certainly not Aragorn's only relations in The Lord of the Rings. He's obviously related to Arwen and her father, Elrond, Elrond being the brother of the King of Númenor, Elros Tar Miniatur. This obviously means that he's also related to Elladan and Elrohir, the sons of Elrond. But he's also distantly related to Galadriel and Celeborn. Through Eärendil, Aragorn is a descendant of King Finwë of the Noldor, who was Galadriel's grandfather. Likewise, through Eärendil, Aragorn is a descendant of King Thingol, Celeborn's great uncle. Obviously, Thingol and Elmo, Celeborn's grandfather, shared the same father, so Aragorn is also related to him. Aragorn also has some other relations, although we don't know exactly how. One is Halbarad, the leader of the Grey Company. Aragorn calls him a kinsman, suggesting that they're not that distantly related. It is possible Halbarad is a descendant from one of the chieftains before Arador, or he might be from Aragorn's mother's side of the family. They were also descended from Aranarth, the first chieftain of the Dunedain. Funnily enough, that would mean Halbarad is also related to everyone else I've mentioned in this video. Somehow, I don't think that would sell the video as much. Finally, Aragorn probably has another very distant kinsman in Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth. Given they were one of Gondor's most important noble houses, it's likely that the princes of Dol Amroth and their predecessors married into the House of Anarion, meaning that Aragorn and Imrahil probably have a common ancestor there. However, even if that didn't happen, the princes are said to have been from a family that were akin to the Lords of Andunier, meaning that they were also descended from Elros Tar Miniatur. In other words, yes, through countless generations, Prince Imrahil is also Aragorn's cousin. So there you have it. Aragorn and many other characters in The Lord of the Rings are all distantly related to each other. Truly, Tolkien's history of Middle-earth was basically the history of one giant family. It's why you can find massive family trees that people have painstakingly created. It would be an interesting exercise to go through all of the characters that Tolkien's created and seeing just how many of them are related to each other. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I've actually dropped the Theoden and Aragorn relation fun fact in one of my other videos, but I thought I'd do a bigger, more in-depth on that fun fact, because that's the thing with Tolkien, you can always go more in-depth. Cheers, farewell, and remember, no, Aragorn is not related to Gimli, it's not possible.